Alors, mesdames et messieurs, 7h01. Bonsoir, mesdames et messieurs, soyez les bienvenus à cette conférence de l'Institut Macdonald-Laurier au sujet des activités d'ingérence de la Chine communiste dans les affaires internes de pays démocratiques comme le Canada. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm Brian Lee Crowley, Managing Director of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and I would like to welcome you to our special event entitled Blunting China's Sharp Power, How Democracies Can Defend Against Chinese Influence Operations. Thank you so much for being here. Recent Canada-China tensions have cast a much-needed spotlight on the challenges inherent in maintaining bilateral relations with authoritarian regimes in general and the arbitrary behavior of China's communist regime in particular. Beijing's protestations to the contrary notwithstanding, China is not governed by the rule of law as we understand it. If the Chinese Communist Party has a view about who should be prosecuted, when and why, and about what sentences should be handed down when those people are convicted, they simply issue orders to the police and the judiciary. And such abhorrent behavior is clearly on display with the arrests of Canadians Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, and the resentencing of alleged drug smuggler Robert Schellenberg from prison to execution, or indeed Beijing's insouciant disregard of its trade obligations in its cavalier treatment of our exports of canola and pork. Yet, while we are rightly concerned about the safety of Canadians in mainland China and the access accorded to our exports there, we should not ignore the dangers posed by Chinese actions much closer to home here in Canada. As described in a recent MLI paper by Taiwan-based security analyst and Canadian J. Michael Cole, who is with us tonight and will be introduced in a minute, China has pursued sharp power influence operations against Canada and our allies. According to Michael, China relies increasingly on unsavoury methods that use co-optation, bribery, incentives, disinformation, censorship, and other means. Revelations of Chinese penetration in the United States, in Australia, in New Zealand, the Czech Republic, and elsewhere have sparked an awakening that, in my view, was long overdue. Now, in many ways, Taiwan has been a testing ground for these kinds of sharp power, which are designed to shape perceptions in Taiwan and erode the belief that the Taiwanese have in the democratic institutions that very much make Taiwan what it is today. Much can be learned from how that country has dealt with such a threat. Canada is not immune to these activities. The Chinese Communist Party has an ongoing campaign to embed agents of influence in Canadian business, in our politics, in our media, and in academia. Simply put, Beijing aims to turn Canadian public policy to China's advantage, to acquire useful technology and intellectual property, and to be able to monitor and, when needed, intimidate Chinese Canadians and others. At MLI, we've been, I'm proud to say, at the forefront of bringing attention to bear on the dangers posed by China's sharp power operations. And with today's event, we hope to explore how our government should confront China's attempts to infiltrate and influence Canadian politics and society, and to review what lessons might be learnt from places like Taiwan that are on the front lines in dealing with such influence operations. And we're delighted to host this event in partnership with the Prospect Foundation in Taiwan. And with this as backdrop, I'm very proud to introduce J. Michael Cole, who I mentioned a moment ago, who will be saying a few words before he introduces some of our other distinguished guests this evening. J. Michael Cole, and by the way, J. Michael stands for Jean-Michel, c'est un Canadien, d'Ancienne Lorette, ou un endroit dans ce coin-là, Charlebourg. J. Michael Cole is a Taipei-based senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, need I say, also with the Washington, D.C.-based Global Taiwan Institute, and the Taiwan Studies program at the University of Nottingham. He's a former analyst with the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service, CSIS, here in Ottawa, and his latest book, Convergence or Conflict in the Taiwan Strait, was published by Routledge in the autumn of 2016. And please join me in welcoming J. Michael Cole to the MLI platform.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I need to start my, my stopwatch because I could talk for a few hours on that very subject. It's a great honor to be here tonight, and I would like to thank the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and the Prospect Foundation for making this event a possible, and I'm quite sure a success. As was said, I am Taipei-based. I have lived in Taiwan since 2005, so it's going to be 14 years next month. And it's very obvious that Taiwan is at the very front lines of Chinese influence operations in the region, but also one of the front lines in the growing, intensifying, deepening, what I would say is a clash of ideologies, pitting liberal democracies against revisionist regimes that propose a more authoritarian model of governance. As a Canadian who has made Taiwan his home, I think by virtue of living in Taiwan, I probably have become a bit more sensitive, if you will, to the different means by which the Chinese Communist Party attempts to erode, undermine, corrupt democratic institutions and belief in the values of liberal democracy, which Taiwan, since democratization in the 1980s, has fully embraced. By virtue of those experiences and studying Chinese influence and intelligence collection in Taiwan, I guess I have gained a new perspective on not only the value of democracy in my home country here in Canada, but more and more attuned to what China is trying to do, not only in Taiwan, but abroad, within the region, and as we know, in places like New Zealand, Australia, United States, across Europe, and yes, surprise, surprise, here in Canada as well. From the perspective of Chinese influence aimed at Canada in the context of cross-strait relations or of Taiwan, I have felt over the years that the Chinese regime has very much conditioned different aspects or segments of Canadian society on matters relating to Taiwan, and oftentimes in so doing, compromising the very values that define us as Canadians. We've allowed the Chinese to force us to make choices oftentimes that go against what we believe in. We've allowed the PRC to condition us into fear and risk avoidance when it comes to Taiwan. Oftentimes turning democratic Taiwan and the world's 20th largest economy as a pariah state rather than a logical partner, which Taiwanese Canadian government, Canadian civil society, Canadian media, and Canadian academia should be collaborating. And this is deeply troubling, in my opinion, to see how successful the Chinese have been at turning a logical, natural ally of Canada into something that we simply do not want to deal with. Of course, in that context, what we refer to as United Front work is not always directly aimed at Taiwan. Oftentimes the Chinese use these techniques to shape the environment in their favor on trade, on politics, nowadays certainly on developments in places like Xinjiang, even more current developments in Hong Kong, but also business deals that are beneficial to the Chinese and those efforts in places like Canada. But nevertheless, Taiwan is what is known as a core principle for the Chinese Communist Party. So any agent of influence who works for the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese government, or is one of those affiliated proxies operating in different countries and here in Canada, will also do his or her utmost to also reflect the CCP line on Taiwan, which certainly implies adherence to the one country, two systems formula for Taiwan, emphasis on the inevitable reunification of Taiwan with what they call the mainland. And oftentimes, these kinds of activities on university campuses, in the media, and even with government agencies succeed in eroding Taiwan's visibility, and again, encouraging people to simply not deal with Taiwan for fear that doing so would cause them difficulties with their business or academic endeavors. We have seen in recent years troubling interference by the Chinese authorities, Chinese government, in Chinese language media here in Canada. And again, if you look at the impact, not only censorship, but also very much towing the line on Taiwan and Beijing's position on Taiwan. What this means is that Chinese consumers of news in places like Canada will get a filtered take on developments in the Taiwan Strait, one which by default downplays the value of democracy and the fact that Taiwan is very much a sovereign entity. We've seen, again, in recent years, several signs of elite capture here in Canada through the funding of think tanks and research centers at universities, and again, the media and whatnot. So this is very much constraining Taiwan's ability to function in Taiwan and to interact, in Canada, sorry, and to interact with their Canadian counterparts. And as I said, this also, unfortunately, has been reflected in our own government's willingness or lack thereof to treat Taiwan as a natural ally. So I will end here so that we have sufficient time for the Q&A. So now it's my honor to introduce Mr. Mark Chen, who is a former foreign minister in Taiwan. Mr. Chen has also been a magistrate in Tainan, in southern Taiwan, has also worked at the presidential office under President Chen Shui-bian and at the National Security Council in Taipei. Mr. Chen is currently the chairman of the Prospect Foundation. Mr. Chen.
Good evening. Thank you, Michael, for your kind introduction. Tonight, I certainly want to express, first of all, our appreciation to all of you. I think, if my memory serves me correct, about 2 years, or maybe less than 2 years, I think one time when I was in Taipei, and we had Dr. Crowley, who went to Taiwan to participate in a kind of seminar or discussion, something of this kind of nature. In that, I was an audience, and I sat down there and listened to Dr. Crowley's presentation and his opinion regarding to Taiwan. I was deeply impressed by Dr. Crowley's understanding of Taiwan and his defense of liberty, human rights, and so forth. That is what I valued, so-called like-minded countries, like-minded people should pull together to be able to do something regarding to what's going on because of China's rise. So speaking of China's rise, I think Taiwan is next to China. We understand China probably much better than anybody else. That's why the Prospect Foundation has been a focus. And many foundations spreading around in the world, they think to contact with our foundation maybe would benefit something because I mentioned earlier. The Chinese policy, Chinese sort of culture for so many, many years I'm proud here to say that we there in Taiwan, we probably the only one, we can detect what they have in their mind compared to what they say in public. So this is very important because they say one thing and do another thing. And for so many years, we have experienced that kind of situation. So I'd like to share, I think, if possible, and through tonight, panel discussions, I'm sure many things would be revealed. And so, but let me go back to a little bit about the situation, because I think from the program, I think I can speak about 8 minutes. I think I can. If over time, please let me know, Michael. I used to be working in the USA, and I used to be working for the Department of Commerce for 19 years. But during that time I was in the USA, I wasn't able to go back to Taiwan because Taiwan was under, during that time, was under Chiang Kai-shek and then his son, Chiang Ching-kuo. Then because of their policy, they won't allow anybody to speak out, to criticize government policy. So during that time, Taiwan was under martial law. So as a result of it, many people, they cannot speak out their voices. And so people like me, we were studying in the USA, we are not allowed to go back to Taiwan because we criticized in USA about what's going on in Taiwan. We want Taiwan to be a free and democratic country. But because of that kind of criticism, we were not allowed to return to Taiwan. So we've been blacklisted until former President Lee Teng-hui was in power. They finally made it possible for many people in Taiwan, they can return back to Taiwan. So I was very happy, so I took that opportunity and I went back to Taiwan. Then because I think my own training was not a socialist or politicians, my own training was about science. I used to be working on a much larger scale, something dealing with the atmosphere, dealing with the aerospace and so forth. But since I had the opportunity to put my effort, try to change some life of the people in Taiwan, so I engaged in that kind of politics. So up to now, I think up to this moment, I was back in Taiwan for 26 years already. All those 26 years in Taiwan, I did my effort, I did my best, try to contribute part of my, as a personal duty, personal learning, hopefully through this kind of connections, many people maybe benefit from it. Now today, here tonight, I'm so impressed because so many people here and so many people even from somebody from Taiwan. I met some of my friends. They drove all the way from Toronto, from Montreal to come to this meeting here. I was really impressed. Why? Because I think people more and more, they understand the value of democracy, value of human rights and so forth. Let me just give one example. A couple of years ago when I was attending a so-called the Forum 2000, created by the former Czech Republic President, Mr. Huawei. In that meeting in Czech Republic, I attended a closed-door session. Was allowed only through 20-some countries' members, only limited to those countries who enjoyed they have the democratic government. So the conclusion of that session was, used to be, I just quote from the conclusion of that meeting. They said, used to be, Russia was leading the way, or the former Soviet Union was leading the way to undermine the value of democracy and human rights. But he said, now everything changed. Now China is leading the way, coupling with Russia. And China has become the big brother, and Russia has become a small potato. So that is real impressive expression that I always remember in my mind. So nowadays, what happens everywhere, people recognize all, whole world. They know China is leading the way, trying to undermine the value of the democracy, and that is a factor. So thereby here in Taiwan, we are so close to China. Every time when we have the election, China would do their part, try to, hopefully doing something, try to overturn or to undermine the significance of the democratic value. So since when President Lee Teng-hui was running for president in 1996, China was using military means to try to scare off Taiwanese, voters, hoping they can change the consequence, change the value, the result of the elections. But in nowhere. Taiwanese people, they understood quite well. Their vote goes to support President Lee Teng-hui because they know Lee Teng-hui has in mind the value and everything included. He received good education in Japan and returned to Taiwan as a professor and so forth. Then after that, every time when it comes to the elections, China wouldn't give up. But nowadays they're using more modern technologies, and so pretty soon I think you people here are going to discuss some issues about it. We have a real prominent scholars coming from Taiwan. I think he can talk a lot more. I think Puma Xian is right here. So from our perspective, I'm the chairman of the Prospect Foundation. This foundation was established about 30 years ago. It's a non-partisan, and we were trying to do some work, I think, at the level of so-called 1.5 or track 2, try to be able to exchange ideas, compare notes. And the purpose of doing this one is we want to share our understanding with my friends, hoping this kind of information would help them out to understand what China has in mind, what China is after. Just leave everything alone. China is trying to push out the influence of Western concept, Western value, including to push out I would call the military or political influence in that part of the world. Push out Japan and push out United States. So therefore, it's time, and it's very important for Taiwan, in our position as the chairman of the Prospect Foundation, to share our understanding to all my friends. What happens to Taiwan is going to happen to any other country tomorrow. So what happens in Hong Kong now is a case in point. So that is the kind of value, that is kind of a point I want to be here to briefly let you know all about it. So once again, I really, from the bottom of my heart, I appreciate this kind of opportunity, and I want to thank Dr. Crowley one more time. Without your insistent insist on having signed the MOU between your MLI and the Taiwan Foundation, I won't be able to come here tonight. I won't be able to speak to all of you. So again, thank you very much, and bonsoir. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Chairman Chen. And I did forget to mention in my introduction that first and foremost, you have been a very good friend over the years and quite encouraging of my work and that of my Taiwanese wife. So we really appreciate your support. Well, going back to Taiwan, one thing that has happened in recent years as well, particularly since President Tsai Ing-wen came into office in May 2016, is Taiwan really investing in activities that seek to bring together experts from all over the world who are studying the very issues that we are discussing here tonight. Starting in 2017, we organized and sponsored workshops in the United States that brought people who have been making the news in recent years, people like John Garneau and Mary Brady, our very own Charles Burton, and many others. And it's very difficult to imagine any other country that that early in the history of Chinese interference would have been willing to invest and take certain risks in making these efforts possible. So through these activities, we have worked really hard to establish networks of experts so that we can learn from their experiences and hopefully that they can also learn from Taiwan's experience. The idea that Taiwan has all the solutions to that growing challenge would be certainly misleading. Taiwan, like every other country, is in the process of learning how to track, identify, mitigate, and hopefully through legal revisions and whatnot, counter the detrimental effects of Chinese interference. As the network grows, we're adding individuals who have special skill sets. As someone who has been researching and writing about Chinese interference in recent years, one name that I would frequently come across is a young researcher in Taiwan named Puma Shen, who has been doing extraordinary work using algorithms and technologies that I could not possibly dream of ever understanding to identify different means of disinformation on social media and messaging apps and whatnot in the context of China and Taiwan. And Mr. Shen has become quite in demand in recent months worldwide because people are realizing that we need more young individuals, tech-savvy, who have the ability to speak good English and whatnot, to learn from them, and again, to exchange notes and all that. So Mr. Shen is the chairman of a recently established foundation called Double Think Lab, and certainly has the Orwellian connotation. He's also the vice president of the Taiwan Association for Human Rights in Taiwan. He focuses heavily on the right to privacy and tracks privacy violations locally. He's also a lawyer, and he's an assistant professor at National Taipei University. He's also an expert in the field of white-collar crime, including state crime and financial crime. Recent articles by Dr. Shen on Chinese disinformation have been circulated wildly across Taiwan and have had a substantial impact on changes in attitudes, both by society and the Taiwanese government, facing that new challenge posed by technology and its marriage with authoritarian regimes. So without further ado, let me introduce Mr. Puma Shen.
Hi everyone, this is Puma Shen from National Taipei University. And just like Michael said, I'm the chairman of the new organization called Double Think Lab. So since I only have like 8 to 10 minutes today, so I'll just try to make it short. So Chinese sharp power, like this graph, really shapes the world we live in. Taiwan as a testing ground for China influence operation is facing many attacks. To understand Chinese influence operation, I think it is crucial to not categorize these attacks in a traditional way. So unlike Russian operation, Chinese influence operation are both centralized and decentralized. So to explain this, the command of the CCP might be centralized, but the operators have their own capacity to initiate all these attacks, as you can see on these slides. And these attacks are often decentralized since the operators seldom collaborate with each other. Operators try to find the niches that they can fit into, and once they find a topic that suits CCP's propaganda for propaganda war purposes, they try hard to apply for government funding, initiate an attack, and revise their strategy when the attack is voided. So therefore, to truly understand Chinese influence operation, it is crucial to specify the nodes that create, generate, or amplify attacks. These nodes serve different purposes, but the main goal is definitely to destabilize society in turn to ruin democracy. So there are 3 ways to reach this main goal. If more nodes are found in the strategy, the more decentralization we see. First, China would aid other authoritarian countries to develop surveillance technology, which will diminish the value of democracy. China could invest in and purchase foreign companies or even enter countries with its own companies to do so. This so-called digital authoritarianism has been established in recent years. This kind of attack characterized by this method is more centralized than other attack types, since the nodes involve well-known companies such as Huawei. Second, China can hack into systems, stealing and collecting information worldwide to serve its propaganda agenda. Hacks by the MSS have launched persistent attacks around the world. These attacks are centralized. However, China could utilize private companies, most of them with party committees, such as TikTok and WeChat, to collect information worldwide. Hundreds of apps like these two serve the purpose, and they collect information that can be utilized using big data analysis. These companies' behaviors are more decentralized than hackers' behaviors, since they do not report to the same authority. Third, China can exploit the technology it has and the information it gathers to launch information warfare attacks. And this kind of attack is my expertise. It is the most decentralized attack type among the 3, since multiple departments in China are involved. And numerous groups, not even companies, are involved, such as religious groups, gangsters, local parties, local elites. These attacks are hard to detect because of decentralization. So here in Taiwan, we face the last 2 attacks, the collecting of private information or stealing of technology, as well as the utilization of private information to deliver problematic messages to different groups of people, which in turn produce distrust. So with all this collected info, it is much easier for China to do the profiling to determine which group of people is more vulnerable than another. So preliminary evidence already indicates that some disinfo has only even been spread in certain countries or provinces in Taiwan. So this is the graph indicating the spread of disinfo attacks from China to Taiwan. The red part is the department in China that initiates all these attacks. The yellow part is the nodes I just specified in the cyber diamond model. And the green part is the content China created and the effect on public perception. So in our analysis for the green part, we categorize this info into several categories: the topics, strategies, emotion, and cognitive bias. So there are several proven attacks, such as Communist League Party, command Weibo accounts that are used to generate fake news. Accounts then disseminate information using bulletin board and TV shows. The Taiwan Affairs Office can also create the narratives like this on the left side that have been duplicated on content farms and delivered to closed messaging groups. Cyber forces and trolls from China also utilize search boosters to establish subliminal attacks that create Google search bias for certain controversial issues. Moreover, local religious groups and parties collaborate with China to disseminate this info. So these are all the graphs, but it's rather complicated. I'll expand that during the Q&A. So our organization now monitors more than 2,600 sites, Weibo accounts, fan pages, and more than 70,000 closed groups in order to determine the disinfo chain initiated by China. These are some examples we got, but what is more important here is that how we can trace them back to China with some legal tools. So there are 2 methods that can be used to trace the disinfo back to China. First, we can try to find who paid for the content farms and whether the content farms paid Google for a search boost. Also, if the marketing companies are paid by the CCP, then it is easier to prove that China is attacking Taiwan. However, this approach is limited. Most content farms operate in Malaysia, America, or other countries, not one here in Canada. And however, this approach is, and this fact makes it difficult for us to delve into the details of their operations. Even with the help of government agencies, it is still difficult to trace how funding flows. Without cooperation with other countries, it is almost impossible for us to determine the details of money laundering. Also, even with law enforcement cooperation with other countries, if trades are all in cash, we need to find another way to prove the existence of this kind of disinfo attacks. And this leads me to the second method we use, to trace the message flow. We already developed our own Chinese words segmentation system, which is not an issue in English, since all English terms are separated. A Chinese sentence contains no delimiters, such as a space to separate words. So therefore, a typical word segmentation system tries to find the possible word compositions of a sentence by comparing it with a lexicon. Because China uses simplified Chinese and there are different cultural usage of Chinese, it is quite important to determine how China writes an article that aims to affect Taiwanese citizens or other citizens around the world who might use the different language or the same language but different terms in China. So we are now categorizing Chinese content forms wordings into several categories and determine the proportion of adjectives, emotional terms, political content, etc. By doing this, we create the author's persona, their writing style, and we can see whether the persona can be detected elsewhere on the internet or on messaging groups such as Line, WeChat, or WhatsApp. And behavioral models can also be calculated to determine whether there is a coordinated inauthentic behavior, the standard used by Facebook and Twitter. However, this method involves an obstacle. Our tracing of persona may stop at a certain point, usually in Malaysia or Hong Kong. And if the obstacle is an IP address that we cannot trace, then our efforts become useless. The whole idea of an IP network involves the sharing of and cooperation with different agencies from different countries. And since China has purchased lots of VPN services, it is crucial for us to cooperate right now to fight back. Moreover, even we recognize an IP network, we still need to link certain IPs to certain departments in China, whether they are the Taiwan Affairs Office, the PLA, or CPPCC. So all of the above are the investigational aspects that really need to be emphasized at this point. However, in the near future, more could be done on the legislation side on the military corruption. So one thing that could be done involves the enactment of FARA, Foreign Agency Registration Act. So maybe we can talk more during the Q&A. And also, in the latest Indo-Pacific strategy report, it is clear that Taiwan is the confirmed partner. However, the role of Taiwan should be elevated, since Taiwan is the country that is suitable for analyzing Chinese disinfo attacks and Chinese information operation. It's already a national security issue worldwide. Taiwan should establish the Center of Excellence that is capable of collecting and analyzing Chinese disinfo attacks, sharing analytical tools with the world to prevent the democracy from collapsing. So that pretty ends my presentation. Thank you so much for listening.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask the panelists to come and take their places up here on the podium while I introduce Bob Fife, who is going to moderate the panel discussion. I think Robert Fife is known to pretty much everybody who follows the news in Canada. He's the Globe and Mail's Ottawa bureau chief and former host of CTV's Question Period. Bob is one of Canada's best known and most respected journalists, and he's broken many stories through his long career, including the Senate expense scandal and the SNC-Lavalin affair. Bob, who has won many awards for his journalism, is also the author of several books. And thanks to Mr. Fife and his colleagues, it's fair to say that the Globe has been the clear leader in covering the many issues surrounding the Canada-China relationship, including those we will be discussing here this evening. So, Bob, will you come up, and can we get the panelists to come up to the platform, please?
Well, first of all, thank you all for coming out. It's a full house, and we're deeply appreciative. I just want to say that when way back in 1994, I went with Jean Chrétien to China and to Beijing. We went with the biggest business delegation of the chief executive officers of Canada, and there was great hope that China was not only going to offer great business opportunities for Canada, but that this was the beginning of a country that was going to open its way to the Western world, and that there would be hope that it would have a civil society and eventually a strong middle class that would lead to hopefully some form of democracy. And in the many years since that period of time, we've seen that the Canadian establishment has turned a blind eye to many of the problems that China poses to the world, including human rights and the fact that we have over 1 million people, Uyghurs, who are in concentration camps, but are very interested in getting business deals and in many cases turning over our technology and our industries to China. And there is a growing consensus among the Western world that this has to be confronted, but it hasn't really been dealt with in Canada. Now I'm going to allow the people who haven't had an opportunity to speak for about 5 minutes, then we're going to open it up to discussion, and then we really want to hear from the audience, because obviously you're all very interested in coming here, and I'm sure you all have really smart questions. So first with Bethany.
Thank you. Shall I
just go ahead.
Okay. Well, I'm an investigative journalist at the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists in Washington, D.C., and I'm very pleased to be here. This is my first time in Ottawa, so thank you so much for having me tonight. And I'm going to speak briefly about China's authoritarian capitalism in the United States, so from an American perspective. When the United States won the Cold War, we believed we had achieved the final and definitive verdict against communism. In our view, that struggle pitted two inherently authoritarian forces, the repressive Communist Party state and its state-run economy, against two inherently liberalizing forces, representative democracy and free market capitalism. But we were wrong. Within 30 years, another Communist Party would rise and threaten to displace America and its values. The Chinese Communist Party has successfully engineered what the Cold War victors believed to be impossible, an unabashedly communist party leading a prosperous capitalist state. Western triumphalism was even more profoundly flawed, however. The belief that free trade capitalism is by its very nature a democratizing force is now demonstrably false. If some dissenting voices did reject the notion that the free market would usher in with it a liberal politics, almost no one predicted that capitalism could be a two-way street. That if democratic values could travel in one direction along it, authoritarianism might just well travel in the other. In 2002, China scholar Perry Link warned in his essay about censorship called "The Anaconda in the Chandelier" that while scholars, journalists, and overseas Chinese can be threatened with being cut off from their access to China, for businesses, the primary threat is exclusion from China's huge potential market. The threats against businesses seem, if anything, even more effective than those against scholars and even more shrouded in sensitivity. Yet his warning was ignored because its implications, if taken to their logical conclusion, were too alarming to comprehend. For more than 2 decades, as its economy became increasingly intertwined with the international system, the Chinese Communist Party has studied how to weaponize its rapidly expanding domestic market for political gain. As early as the late 1990s, even before China's entry into the World Trade Organization dramatically amplified its global economic engagement, the party had already used the promise of its market to tame one of America's preeminent instruments of soft power projection, Hollywood. A spate of pro-Tibet movies ended in 1998 when Disney CEO Michael Eisner traveled to Beijing to apologize for the 1997 film Kundun, which portrayed the life of the current Dalai Lama and was directed by Martin Scorsese. China had banned Disney films after Kundun was released. Eisner told party officials that the film was a stupid mistake. Within 6 months of Eisner's groveling, the ban was lifted, and Chinese theaters featured Disney's Mulan with Chinese subtitles. there have been no further major motion pictures featuring Tibet or its exiled spiritual leader. As China's domestic film market has burgeoned, so too have its censors' demands. Beijing has wielded this power adroitly, mandating that production companies abide by the party's bottom lines in order to earn one of the 34 coveted spots allotted to foreign films each year. The result has been deafening silence from Hollywood on the realities of Chinese Communist Party rule, and increasingly, a requirement that China be featured in a proactively positive way. This is just one example. In the past 20 years, and with growing momentum in the past 2 years, company after company has succumbed as Beijing has dangled in front of them the glittering riches of a market size of 1.4 billion, all for the tiny, tiny price of silence. Google, LinkedIn, Apple, Marriott, Mercedes-Benz, not an American company, Zara, United Airlines, and now the National Basketball Association all have agreed to self-censor or have apologized with great contrition after a tweet or a survey or a map that didn't fully align with the Chinese Communist Party's priorities, and they've sworn to avoid such mistakes in the future. It's not just companies. In 2009, North Carolina State University canceled its invitation to the Dalai Lama after its Chinese government-funded Confucius Institute objected. After leaving office, numerous elected officials and government bureaucrats have taken positions at lobbying firms to represent the Chinese government's interests in Washington. This is dangerous to American national security and the well-being of our democracy. Pervasive censorship suppresses important knowledge and artificially distorts our debate, making us less prepared to respond to risks and threats posed by a rising authoritarian power. It also curtails our most basic civil rights, thus weakening the system of liberal democratic values that the United States has tried to instill in domestic and international institutions. Now, there are a couple of trends that are now going in a more positive direction. The first one is, if you followed the controversy with the NBA and China, that really brought this issue to the forefront of the American national debate for the first time. It's really interesting for people who watch China to see America wake up to a problem that we've been watching very closely for 5 years. And the second, and it really caused a lot of outrage from just average Americans, which I found to be to give me a lot of hope for the future. Second is an unanticipated side effect of President Trump's lengthy trade war with China. The once unimaginable concept of decoupling, the unjoining of China and America's economies, it no longer seems completely far-fetched. Some American businesses have already started shifting their supply chains away from China. While a total decoupling is likely impossible and I would think ill-advised, the new trend helps strengthen the hand of American businesses. China no longer seems as mandatory a market as it once did.
That's great. Thank you. And this is exactly happening here. Okay, my friend Charles.
Thank you very much, Bob. I've been asked to talk about Chinese influence operations in Canada in academia, think tanks, Chinese influence operations directed at Canadian politicians and policymakers, so cut me off when it gets to 5 minutes because there's obviously a lot to talk about with this particular topic in this particular country. I think that, it's clear that all diplomatic missions in Canada have a function to promote the interests of their nations through public diplomacy, to encourage a favorable impression of their country among Canadians, and to engage with Canadian policymakers. That's a normal diplomatic function. A lot of it done over wine and good food. But the question at hand here is, are the People's Republic of China's influence operations in Canada carried out in unacceptable ways, exceeding the bounds of conventional diplomatic practice, or indeed, is the government of China implicated in violations of the laws of Canada through their agents of influence and other operations to encourage Canada to adopt policy sympathetic to the goals of the Chinese regime in Canada? And this topic is one which, as Brian was saying, Bob Fife and Steve Chase, who's there for the Globe and Mail, have been following up with considerable tenacity. But it is not something which is specific, I think, to one newspaper and one political perspective in our country. I mean, for Post Media, we've got Terry Glavin and Tom Blackwell and others, and Globe and Mail also Xiao Xu. And for the Vancouver Sun, we've got Jeremy Nuttall and Joanna Chiu. Today, actually, earlier, I suggested that Joanna's Chinese skills are weak. That is not so, and I apologize to her for that. But, you know, the journalists and several others have encouraged a Canadian public opinion which is increasingly sensitized to the threat to Canadian security and Canada's global interest of China's sharp power. But our government, as you know, many of us will respond, has not been showing a commensurate response in terms of adjusting our national policy to better address the reality of China's influence operations. You know, if you look at numbers, I looked up the Global Affairs Canada diplomat list, and China has considerably more diplomats accredited to Canada than any other nation. That's 163 Chinese diplomats in Canada compared to 146 for the United States. And for a country that might have comparable engagement with Canada as China, the United Kingdom, they have 22 diplomats. So 146 versus US, China 163, UK 22. And of interest to what I'm going to say next is that the United States has 23 diplomats resident at its consulate in Toronto, whereas China has 43 diplomats resident at its consulate in Toronto, almost double the number of US diplomats there. So the question is, why does China have so many more diplomats here than any other nation? Is it that a significant proportion of those PRC diplomats are in fact engaged in representing the United Front Work Department of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, working with agents of influence here, or engaged in other undeclared functions such as coordinating espionage operations? Or the other possibility is that Chinese diplomats operate at a much, much lower level of efficiency than the counterparts in other countries. Let's keep an open mind to this question. Last month, the student union at McMaster University in Hamilton voted to de-ratify the student club status of the CSSA, the Chinese Students and Scholars Association there. The ruling cited a regulation against club conduct that endangers the safety or security of any person or property. It was prompted by evidence that earlier in the year, the McMaster CSSA had coordinated the disruption of a public seminar conducted by the Canadian Uyghur activist Rukia Turdish on the topic of the Chinese government's cultural genocide program against its Turkic Muslim population in the northwestern regions of the PRC. And Turdish's son, who is a student at McMaster, was threatened over social media, allegedly at the direction of a PRC diplomat stationed in the education section of the PRC consulate in Toronto. Then there was, to the student government, compelling anonymous testimony given by Chinese students studying at McMaster, confirmed by multiple sources, that the Chinese consulate in Toronto tasks the CSSA to gather intelligence on Chinese students and professors and others in the university and the community. And of course, they also have evidence that the consulate funds and coordinates political demonstrations in Canada to support China's communist regime, including the recent worldwide demonstrations supporting PRC policies on Hong Kong. These, the Chinese government denies the quite strong evidence that they provide money and support because of documents that have come out. But they say that these are self-motivated patriotic behavior against anti-China separatist activities. So the key is self-motivated. But my feeling is if in fact it is directed by diplomats, those diplomats are acting in a capacity inconsistent with their diplomatic mandate. And of course, when they're identified on the diplomatic list, no one says they're working for the Chinese Communist Party Ministry of State Security or for the Chinese Communist Party Central Committee United Front Work Department. Now, if I could turn to the allegations that some Canadian politicians are under the influence of a foreign power. And we do see in Canada examples of politicians who explicitly or implicitly express the perspective that Canada's primary interest in relations with China is the promotion of Canada's prosperity through trade and investment, that that's the main thing. And that all other Canadian concerns in terms of security, such as the substantial risks of Huawei 5G, or about China's domestic violations of human rights in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, should be subordinated to the larger economic imperatives of Canada-China relations, because the PRC embassy here insists that that's what we should do. So similarly, Canada should shun Taiwan and the Dalai Lama, or China says that they will make us suffer economically through measures such as imposing spurious non-tariff barriers on Canadian agricultural exports to China, as we've seen most recently in the Huawei CFO extradition case. Some Canadian politicians and policymakers who support a China policy for Canada that amounts to supporting PRC regime interests in Canada have experienced lucrative careers related to China after retirement from public service. But there is no evidence of an improper connection between the two. We don't have the smoking gun that suggests that there's anything here. But there have been substantive indications of cause for concern about Chinese influence operations in other countries, as Michael alluded to, that one could rightly suspect could have as yet undiscovered counterparts in Canada. And that's Bob and Steve should, get on it right away. Am I out of time? Okay, let me give you 1 minute. I would refer specifically to the case of Yang Zhen, the New Zealand Parliament member who was on their Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Select Committee, who had falsified his application for immigration to New Zealand as an adult in 2004 by removing from his CV the references to his work history exclusively in People's Liberation Army institutions, and replaced them with civilian institutions that he in fact had never worked in. And this would be consistent with the United Front Work Department documents that have been leaked, suggesting that they want to have ethnic Chinese friendly to the PRC elected to democratic legislatures. Finally, I would refer to the case of the former, but there's no indication that Mr. Yang has done anything wrong. He did say that he was a member of the Chinese Communist Party but had been inactive, but he sits as a member of the Nationalist Party of New Zealand. In the case of Mr. Robb, the former Minister of Trade and Investment who negotiated the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, he and also was involved in the 99-year lease that was extended on the port of Darwin to a Chinese billionaire. Subsequently, it was revealed that he was, even while still in the end of his parliamentary career, in receipt of a $73,000 a month private consultancy amounting to $880,000 a year. If I could just say finally, and there's no indication that Mr. Robb has done anything improper or illegal, but after Australia implemented their Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme Act last year that came into effect in March of this year, Mr. Robb and other Australian politicians and others resigned from China-connected lucrative positions. There is no apparent interest in Canada in exploring a similar legislation for our country. Let me leave it there.
If I just may add, John McCallum, who was our former ambassador to China, who ended up getting fired. Before he was appointed, he had accepted $75,000 in free trips from China. And the new ambassador, Dominic Barton, who is highly qualified in many ways. He was the global manager of McKinsey & Company, which is the world's largest consulting firm. But this large consulting firm, one of their largest clients happens to be Chinese state-owned companies and corporations with a great deal of influence in keeping Beijing happy. Margaret.
Thank you. I'm Margaret McQuaig Johnston, and I worked in the federal government for 37 years, and 13 of those as an assistant deputy minister. And I've collaborated with China for 40 years, since my first visit in 1979. But China's recent actions have compelled me to start to speak out. We're in a transition period right now. I managed two transitions when I was in the Privy Council office in the 1980s, and I was in departments managing transitions from that end for many years after. And so I know that they're a really good time to do a reset of policy. So what I'd like to do is propose a new approach in the context of our China crisis. And this is an approach that addresses the situation of our detainees, our agriculture bans, and shows China consequences for its actions and refocuses our engagement in Asia. I'd like to start by commending the government's actions to date, and we should continue the clear, strong statements on rule of law and against China's disproportionate retaliations. We should also continue getting other countries to speak out. That's the first time this strategy has been tried in these international situations. And both of those things are statements on rule of law and getting countries to speak out. We've been instructed by China to stop, so we know it's hit a chord and we should keep doing that. We should also continue our WTO appeals, and we should step up inspections of agriculture products from China. This is not business as usual. We don't want Canadian companies to be further damaged, but we should not be out there drumming up new business and new collaborations with happy signing events. It's unseemly, and we don't want China to benefit from new initiatives while it's holding our kidnapped Canadians. On Huawei, we should announce the ban, and we should grandfather current Huawei equipment if we can do that safely, or subsidize the carriers if necessary. We need a new Indo-Pacific strategy, just as Japan found when it faced kidnapped citizens and agriculture bans in 2010 and 2012. We should deepen our relations with other countries, as they did. And those are countries with common interests, not just like-minded countries, but those with common interests, which is a larger group of countries. On Taiwan, I've been very pleased with the government's sending our naval ships through the Taiwan Strait, saying that Taiwan should be able to attend international meetings of WHO and ICAO. That's exactly right. And also some preliminary steps towards seeing if Taiwan could become part of CPTPP. I think those are really great steps. In addition to that, we should be deepening our science and innovation relations with Taiwan. We should initiate security discussions with Taiwan. We should be sending junior ministers who can engage on policy discussions. We should start discussions towards a FIPA, and we should rename the Canadian Trade Office Taipei, the Canada Office Taipei, because it does much more than trade. As part of this new Indo-Pacific strategy, we need a new strategy on China, one that recognizes that the China of today, the China of Xi Jinping, is not the China of his predecessors. It's a much more aggressive China, and you all know what I'm talking about, and we'll talk about it in the discussion. There will be areas where we will want to work with China, but there will also be areas where we will want to insulate ourselves. And in that respect, I think we may want to consider adopting similar legislation to Australia's Foreign Influence Transparency Act. Now, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor were detained for 5 months, then put in prison for a month, and then arrested formally. And then they've been in prison for another 4 months after that. So they have not yet been charged. That's a really important step in China's process. If they are charged, it will be a signal to us that they will be there for much longer. And so therefore, if that happens, we should act on our Magnitsky legislation. Michael Kovrig's responsibilities when he was at the embassy, and I won't get into them, but they fit the legislation perfectly. Under the legislation, we should name the Ministry of State Security officials who authorized their detention and go up the line from there if necessary, as far as the government wants to go. And if we do not take action under Magnitsky, then I think we should rescind the act, because that act should not be in place just for countries that we do not fear. And if Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor are charged, and by the way, we should keep mentioning Robert Schellenberg and Fan Wei, another Canadian who is in, has now a drug charge and execution sentence against him. If Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor are charged, it'll be time for Canada to take much stronger action. Charging an innocent Canadian diplomat who is merely on leave is an aggressive action of one state against another. So then we should do quite a number of other things, and I've got some examples, and we should do them all at once for major impact. Increase further the cost of Canadian real estate for people from China. Send home the pandas 3.5 years early. Pandas are a gesture of friendship. China is not acting friendly towards us. Send home the Chinese Olympic athletes. Why are we training their athletes for the Winter Olympics in China in 2022? Do not plan events for the 50th anniversary of recognition next year. That normally would be a huge, big celebration, but don't even pick up the phone to start planning events. And review whether we want to withdraw from the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And I say review because while it would take us out of one of China's pet projects, we've only been in for 1.5 years, and we may want to stay in if we have in place a new Indo-Pacific strategy, because it would provide a platform in which we could engage with other countries in that region. So those are serious actions, but we're in a serious situation.
That's great. And just as an aside, Steve and I, my colleague Steve Chase and I are at a story tomorrow that we actually sent 175 military athletes to military sports games in China earlier this month. Well, we have 2 Canadians who are being held hostage. It's mind-boggling. Now, we're going to open up the discussion. I'm going to ask Puma and Michael the first question, but everybody feel free to jump in. And then as soon as we get through our 25 minutes, we will open it up to the audience because I know people have a lot of questions. Huawei is a big subject in Canada. It was put on hold because of the federal election, but the government has to make a decision on whether it should join the United States and Australia and New Zealand in banning Huawei from 5G technology. You both have experience living very close to Beijing. I'd be very interested in starting perhaps with you, Puma. Should we allow 5G, or are the Americans right when they say that 5G should not be, Huawei should not be allowed into Western mobile networks?
I mean, for me, it's like, because 5G technology is not, I mean, in the case of Huawei, I mean, what is more important here is that they could, like, collecting the private information, and that other, like ID or like any IP address, like anything like that could be associated with. So for me, it's not just Huawei, because China is really good at AI and really good at big data analysis. So with all this collected info, it is easier for them to determine like which group of people is more vulnerable there. So let me take an example. In Taiwan, we have lots of convenience stores in Taiwan. And then all the convenience store has the huge like TV screen out there, and they have the spy camera in the front of it. So they can collect all the face recognition and see your body, what sex you belongs, and when will you watch the television, which color you prefer, how long will you stay your eye contact with that television. Like all this information could be collected, and then with that information, they can do big data analysis and try to interfere the election. Because like according to our analysis, you only need to affect less than 7% of the residents to really have taken effect on the election part. So if you have that kind of technology, it is easier for them to determine, which group is vulnerable. And it's not just about 5G. Like so many information collected by the media services, or by the spy camera, or by social media. All these information collected are vulnerable. So like for me, like 5G is just like a small portion of all these big issues.
Michael.
Well, I completely agree with Puma. I would simply add that we also need to bear in mind that Huawei or any large company in China is not a normal company as we understand it in the West. So with that, there are inherent problems, particularly the fact that if the CCP requires a Chinese company to pass on personal information, the company basically does not have a choice but to comply with that demand. So it's not only a question of backdoors and technology, but also the very structure of that company and the imposition or the influence that the CCP will have on companies like Huawei, and we can name several others. And I would also add, as a flagship of China, one of the major corporations being Huawei, if we start allowing these companies with a troubled past and possible links to People's Liberation Army into our societies, we are normalizing companies that are troublesome, and some of which are complicit in widespread gross human rights violations in China. I'm sorry, but we are also not dealing with a normal country. We are currently dealing with a country that runs concentration camps. And the last time that a country ran concentration camps, we all know what happened afterwards. So we also need to keep that in mind as we allow major Chinese companies that answer to the CCP into our societies.
Margaret, you want that?
Yeah, just to add to that, I've had discussions with people in Washington about Huawei and 5G, and the Director General of Cyber for Homeland Security isn't just concerned about backdoors, as we've heard about. He's also concerned about bug doors, so a bug that they put in the system and then it can be released at another time. And of course, there's just shutdowns of the system. And this is a system that doesn't just run our whole information technology, but it also would be connected to the electricity grid. So why would we let a state-owned enterprise, that's effectively what it is, because 1% is owned by Mr. Ren, and 99% is run by a trade union committee, which is run by the Communist Party. So it's not a private company. So why would we invite our SOE, an SOE to run our IT and our grid? We've been the subject of veiled threats in Canada. If we don't accept, worse things are going to happen to us. But I would point out that there is no reciprocity here. We wouldn't be, not that we have Nortel anymore because of all the hacking and bugs and so on around Nortel. That's really a shame. But we wouldn't be allowed to send our own company, much less a crown corporation, to China and run their IT. That's not permitted under their so-called negative list. The one thing that I would flag here, and I'm quite concerned about it, is that in the new legislation for foreign investment, it's the Foreign Investment Act that comes into effect on January 1st, China says that whatever investment decision is made in another country, it will be allowed to take reciprocal action against that country. So since we don't have Nortel anymore, there wouldn't be any equivalent reciprocal action. But certainly they haven't hesitated to take other actions that aren't at all connected.
Bethany, and then if you want to say something.
I would certainly echo all the points that have already been made, and I would like to add a couple of things. And one of that is that Huawei has, achieved a global dominance already, and is very prominent in 5G through Chinese government subsidies. It outbids everybody. There's really only a few companies that are capable of building 5G infrastructure. I think Nokia and Ericsson, and then Huawei. And Huawei will bid, far, far lower, far, below market price. And I think it's very worthwhile to ask why. Why has the Chinese government made that, their strategy? And it's obviously not purely for business reasons. It's so they can build critical infrastructure all over the world. And I would relate that to, the point that I made about how China uses capitalistic or company entanglements to force its will. And in this case, I'm not referring to censorship, but rather to a more heavy-handed kind of blunt power. If you, Italy, or the UK, do not do this, or you do not support us in this foreign policy goal, or if you don't sign our letter at the United Nations saying that we have a wonderful human rights record regarding Muslims, or any of these other, of their foreign policy goals, if you don't sign on, we will delay building your whatever, or, we will just, happen to forget to update your whatever. So it gives China an immense amount of control. And when I say China, it's because it is so clear that Huawei is not a normal company. Chris Balding, who is a scholar who's now based in Vietnam, looked at the CVs of many Huawei top-level executives. Many of them just publicly, and their Chinese language CVs, indicated that they were sort of double-hatting with the MSS. Now, that's not proof, but it is highly suggestive of the relationship between Huawei and the Chinese government. So I can't think of any reason why any country should jump forward into such an enormous decision about the future of their country's critical telecommunications and choose a company like that when there are so many profound questions, not just about what will happen to that data, but what will happen to your country's own ability to make its own decisions.
And I just wanted to ask you on the same subject, because we hear from people who are saying, don't worry about Huawei, that we can keep it out of the core. We have a testing facility that's very much like the UK, when a lot of experts are saying, wait a minute here, with 5G, it's not the same. You can't just test the technology. There's too many ways to get in. Charles.
I mean, in the Times today, there's a report that Boris Johnson will follow the previous Prime Minister's adoption, permitting Huawei under the same conditions as Bell and Telus are hoping for, which is not into the core network. And that would involve GCHQ, continuing to collaborate with Huawei to assess their software and hardware solutions, which is the function that the CSE is currently undertaking as GCHQ's counterpart. I think it's unfortunate the British make that determination, because I think it's likely that our government would then feel that they're given permission to do the same thing, and the pressure of Bell and Telus, because of the enormous hit that they would take if they had to remove their largely Huawei 3G and 4G installations, which, as Bethany pointed out, were underbid by 30 or 40% from competitors due to Chinese government subsidies, that we could get that Huawei system. And I would note that one of Mr. Trudeau's election promises was to reduce cell phone costs by 25%. If he isn't planning to agree to Huawei, how would he achieve that? Because not using Huawei, Bell and Telus suggest, will increase their cost of providing services, because they'll have to take out a lot of the Huawei kit and substitute it with Ericsson or Nokia. I think the other aspect is, in general, assuming that China has a global plan to dominate telecommunications for the leverage over infrastructure and other things that would provide, is once Telus and Bell have installed extensive Huawei equipment based on commitments given by the government of China with regard to supervision and so on, If the government of China then later on says, oh, sorry, there's a miscommunication here, we're not going to continue to cooperate with the CSE, then we're stuck with this stuff. There's no turning back. So I really feel, in light of the British government's decision, all the more concerned about Canada's determination on this matter. And I am worried that we will get the Huawei 5G and that we will regret it very much in years ahead.
Final word, Margaret.
Yeah, getting 5G is a decision for today. But if we had Huawei 5G throughout our whole system, when it comes to 6G, 7G, the technologies we're going to have, 15, 20, 40 years out, it would be inevitable that we would be building Huawei on top of that. And I think that's just stepping in way too far. The other two companies that are strong, Nokia and Ericsson, are as good as Huawei in virtually everything and better than Huawei in a few features.
Security.
Yeah, security, yeah.
So before we open it up to the audience, there is a consensus in the United States that China is a threat. And it's not, and it's one that's been developing probably in the last decade, I would think. And it's Republicans and it's Democrats. It has nothing to do with the Trump administration. This is a congressional consensus. But we don't have that here in Canada. And I'll put it maybe to you first, Margaret. Why isn't there, because it seems to me the Canadian establishment, and I mean political and corporate and academic actually, to a large extent in the universities, are quite, are not sounding any alarm bells about what the Americans are sounding. And in fact, the Americans have done many, many studies, congressional studies about the threat. Why isn't that happening here in Canada?
Well, yeah, I've started to speak out. I think there are a lot of others who feel the same way that I do, but they want to be able to go back to China, or they want to be able to keep those connections so they can continue to do their work in the future. So, I think that explains some of it. We drank the Kool-Aid on this a long time ago, and I have published glowing things about China's innovation system, and it's all true. Their innovation system is spectacular, and they're so good in so many things. They deserve to take over the world because they've got their act together. They've got a far better science and technology strategy than we do here in Canada. But you just have to look at their recent behaviors and say, sorry, something's going on here, and it's not acceptable. And when it comes to, I can't explain at this point the difference in the political lenses, because you're right, the Democrats and the Republicans are on the same page in the States. We don't seem to be quite there yet. We have had the long family history of the Trudeaus in China. We've got very strong business connections. But I think, with the combination of things happening now and whatever's going to happen to us, actions taken by China over the coming months and years, I think there will be more people like me who stand up and just say, this is not acceptable.
Michael.
Well, this is actually a question I've been asking myself, both as a Canadian and someone who spends quite a bit of time in Washington, D.C. I think part of the answer lies with the fact that it lies with geopolitics. For the Americans, the rise of China and the different instruments it has been using to influence the region and perhaps the entire world is a clear, immediate threat to American interests in the region, in that part of the world, starting with Asia, but also other corners of the world. Besides the military threat against claimants in the South China Sea and certainly against Taiwan, the various uses of sharp power by China are oftentimes aimed at undermining American presence in the Indo-Pacific. So of course, by virtue of this, it compels people in Washington, D.C. to start paying attention to all these different instruments. Obviously, Canada is not playing that game. We do claim that we're a Pacific power, but certainly do not have the installations and the agreements and the alliances in that part of the world that the United States had since the end of World War II. So my view is that the reason why we've seen an awakening in the United States, and by the way, that did not start under President Trump. That was not, as you rightly said, it was not created by President Trump. We started seeing a reckoning or acknowledgement in the United States, I would say, early in the second Obama term. And that's when across Washington, D.C. establishments, Democrat, Republican, academia, think tanks, we realized that, okay, for decades we've been giving to China. We brought China into WTO. We gave it most favored nation status with the expectation that at some point China would become a little bit more like us, if not even become democratic like us. Those hopes were dashed over the years with realization that this is not where China was going. And if there were still any individuals who were wondering or had questions about the direction, I think that President Xi Jinping made it very clear that strategy has failed miserably and that indeed, or in fact, China is moving in the opposite direction. So this is a direct challenge to US security posture in East Asia. And again, this has led to a lot of people to start asking important questions. Canada simply does not have that kind of presence in Asia, so it's taking us a little bit longer to start realizing and asking the questions what impact it will have on our own future.
Bethany.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That China's, the threat that it poses to American interests in the Asia-Pacific, that threat lives very. It's in the very front of our minds, or at least for people in Washington. I would answer the question in inverse by looking at three aspects to the reasons that there is a strong bipartisan consensus in DC right now about China. So the first one, it would be sort of a variation on that, which is that Americans are really obsessed with being number one. We love the fact that we have the largest economy in the world. We love the fact that we have the most powerful military in the world. By we, I don't necessarily mean myself, but that's part of our national consciousness, and that's unique. Because we are, at least in those two aspects, still technically number one. And what has happened in the last 5 years is that we have seen that both of those statuses are under threat. There's various different predictions as to when the Chinese economy will surpass the U.S. It used to be 2050, then it was 2030. Some people say 2025. Maybe it'll be next year. Who knows? And the same with the Chinese military. We've seen extremely rapid modernization. Their military budget has grown every year, by a double-digit percentage, and there are very, very serious concerns about the U.S. ability to even win a regional war in the Asia-Pacific if things, if we're not lucky or if we're unlucky. So that would be one, major thing that really only applies to the U.S. I spent a couple of months in Germany a couple of years ago reporting on issues related to China, and it's sort of the same there, I would say, as in Canada, which is that, well, Germany is not the top economy or the top military in the world anyway, so what does it matter if China's number 4 or number 2? Who cares, right? But for the U.S., it's a big deal. Second, and I do not know if this would apply to Canada at all, but if you want to compare, for example, the debate about Russian influence in the United States with the debate about Chinese influence, things become very clear. Russia did something very smart, which is they chose a side. Right? They chose Trump, they chose the Republicans, and that has weaponized our own political polarization against us. You can't put a Democrat and a Republican in the room and get them to agree on what Russia did in 2016, even though it's very clear. China, in fact, I would say made a strategic mistake by trying to become friends with everybody. They did not do what Russia did and pick a side. And so that means that in the US, as things kind of have gotten worse, it was very easy for people to turn on a dime, for everyone to do that and to agree, because there's not really any areas related to China so far that can be used to score a political point. So that's the second one. And the third thing, oh dear, what was I going to say? Well, those are the two main ones. If it comes, maybe I'll remember. But I don't know if that would apply to Canada at all, about the is one of the parties here much closer to China?
Yeah. Yes.
Well, there you go.
I would say that traditionally, the Liberal Party and I guess the Red Tory tradition has been that we should look to China to distinguish ourselves from the United States. And certainly in the earlier period of Pierre Trudeau, he engaged in a lot of activities like the Foreign Investment Review Agency and the cultural content limitations of the CRTC to try and reduce U.S. influence in Canada. And China was, a place where we could go and be different. And it's the irony of Mr. Trudeau's affection for Fidel Castro and for Chairman Mao. This is the same man who, felt that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms was the right thing for Canadians, but we established diplomatic relations with China at the same time that Chinese weaponry was killing American soldiers in Vietnam. So it was certainly a statement. And I think subsequently, we have got this idea that China is our source of diversifying our economic dependence away from the United States. So China says, well, if you compromise on those human rights and concerns over the South China Sea and other things, we will give you a free trade agreement. Incidentally, the free trade agreement negotiated by Mr. Robb, who subsequently received the $880,000 a year private consultancy, was looked at by the Canadian government after China suggested we do a cut and paste and replace the word Canada for Australia and go with it to be a bad deal for Australia and therefore not one Canada would want. If it's not going to be free trade, how about sectoral trade? And so we do have this notion of a relationship with China where we will look at the trade interests and why we don't have any significant discourse comparable to what goes on in the United States and other countries. I think really is because of the domination of Chinese money. China doesn't have soft power, they have money power. And if you look at something like the 6-member China Research Partnership that was set up a few years ago that the Chinese embassy is very enthusiastic about, the top 3 members of the Asia Pacific Foundation, the Canada-China Business Council, and the Canada-China Institute for Business and Development. The bottom 3 members are the Institute for Asian Research at the University of British Columbia, the Munk School for Global Affairs at the University of Toronto, and the China Institute at the University of Alberta. And so you can see that the ones with the money are at the top of the list, and the ones producing the policy reports are below that. And one could assume that there's some relationship between the funding and the reluctance of these institutions to issue documents which suggest that there's anything wrong with what the People's Republic of China is doing either in Canada or domestically. And we know from the lobbyist reports that the companies that are very influential in the Canada-China Business Council, such as the Desmarais Power Corporation or Bombardier or SNC-Lavalin, also spend a great deal of time lobbying in the PMO. So you have an interesting dynamic between business academics and the political elite of Canada. And all of that is suggesting, I think, Clive Hamilton of New Zealand has suggested that Canada has the greatest elite capture by the People's Republic of China of any nation in the developed Western world. And I'm inclined to think that that's true.
Okay, on that note, we're going to open it up to discussion, and there's a gentleman right there with his hand up. You don't have to move. Somebody's going to come and I just have one thing to say to everybody. Please, no speeches. Good questions, but no speeches.
Thank you. My name is Edward Atraji, and I want to emphasize that I'm an aerospace engineer. I want to emphasize engineer. Xi Jinping is an engineer. As an engineer, I think he has done a marvelous job for China. We have enabled Xi Jinping and the Chinese economy to grow because we have shut off our natural resources from being developed. Chinese economy is based on coal. They are using the oxygen of the planet to drive their economy. But because greenhouse gases do not respect borders, we are suffering from it without realizing it. And
Question?
The question is, why are we allowing China to get away with this and simply hobbling our own industry from developing. Thank you.
Margaret.
Oh, great, thanks. Well, this is something that we have tried very hard to get progress on, to help China with its climate change agenda. And it has developed targets for itself. But we've basically offered our clean tech, our clean energy companies to help them develop their renewable sector and to take on board clean coal, for example, and CO2 capture and storage. So there's a lot going on between China and Canada on that. The problem with it is that in a lot of cases, the technology has just been absconded with through joint ventures. The joint ventures aren't 50-50 or 51-49, they're 90-10 or 80-20. 70-30 in favor of the Chinese partner. And then I've looked at these over time, and the Chinese partner tries to take over the company. So if you talk to people who have done the investments between Canada and China in the clean energy, clean tech space, they'll say that Canadian companies have not been making money. And it just doesn't make sense because there's such a big need, as you've so well put it, but it's not happening. And more coal facilities are being built.
And maybe Bethany just wants to speak about the American experience, because they've had the same, I mean, why a lot of American companies are turning off China is because I'll let you speak to it.
Am I speaking on the environmental issue or the
just the whole thing
venture?
of joint ventures.
Joint ventures, yes. I do feel one thing that's good about this administration is that they are taking seriously the threat to IP and the really aggressive tactics that Chinese companies have used. We don't have any policies right now that push back against joint ventures, but the FBI has really stepped up their prosecutions of Chinese people in the U.S. Who have stolen technology. So that's a positive step forward, I would say. On the environmental issue, I just want to say, as an American, that we have, America right now has absolutely, no grounds to criticize China on that. They recently surpassed us in terms of their total carbon emissions, but the U.S. is still the highest in carbon emissions per capita, and obviously our current administration is trying to roll that back further. So criticize us too.
Okay, 1 second. Sorry, I saw a hand up there, but Dean, go ahead.
Dean Baxendale, Optimum Publishing from Toronto. This subject has come to me over the last couple of years through a particular journalist who some of you may know here, Sam Cooper, who has been exposing much of the things going on with China here in this country, and specifically about the influence of China. But I want to get and ask the question. Right now, as we all know in this room, the Cullen Commission is going on in British Columbia to investigate money laundering and the involvement of casinos in our country. And I want to make sure everyone here understands the importance of this commission for our whole democracy in the Western world. Furthermore, I just wanted to say this. I'd like to know everyone's position on how they're going to help support what's going on at the Cullen Commission to make sure the right witnesses can come forward to actually provide the testimony that will actually expose the CCP and their involvement with money laundering through the Great Circle Boys out of China and other organized crime groups. It is the biggest transnational organized crime story of this century. But so my question is, supporting the Cullen Commission moving forward. How do we do that? Because it's important for the democracy.
Well, I do admire Sam Cooper's work as well. I should have mentioned him earlier. I think in terms of these issues, there has been a reluctance on the part of the government to allocate resources to come to terms with this Chinese money of doubtful provenance, largely associated with the senior levels of the Chinese Communist Party. And that's as you say, the casinos and the real estate. And certainly that's something which goes to the absolute center of Chinese communist power, because so many of them are concerned about China's future and would like to have their money safely parked in our country, and what better place than Vancouver to do that. I think in general terms, our government has not been allocating enough China-based resources to investigatory agencies, including CSIS, CSE, and the RCMP. And and I know that these agencies provide the government with recommendations with regard to Chinese associated malfeasance in Canada or allegations of such, and our government is inclined to shelve that on the basis, like everything else, that if we do anything like this, the Chinese government will retaliate against us, and those very high-level Canadian business interests will suffer. And if I could just to return to Bethany's point, I think that what you see in successful business in Canada-China successful business are those very large firms who have very close political connections with the senior levels of the CCP. And ordinary Canadian small and medium-sized businesses are the ones being screwed by having their intellectual property and proprietary manufacturing processes taken by their Chinese partners, or the imposition of internal regulations or new taxes that squeeze them out of the market. And there have been so many negative experiences that it really disincentives smaller Canadian businesses from going there. But those large companies, well-connected companies who lead the CCBC, the Canada-China Business Council, are doing well, but at a political cost. And certainly the moment that any of those companies says anything, along the lines of the NBA, they're out of that market, and all the political benefits that derive from the large profits they're able to derive from their China business will vanish. And I don't think the Canadian business or political elite would like to see that.
Michael, and then you.
Well, I would certainly echo Charles's comments on further empowering intelligence agencies and their assistance to central government. I mean, we've seen similar issues in Taiwan, particularly when you talk about casinos. There is always inevitably organized crime involvement in those operations. We know for a fact, and again, Taiwan is a clear case of this, a good number of triads operating in places like Hong Kong and Macau, in the Pacific, even in North Korea, also are historically pro-Chinese Communist Party. So obviously there is a criminal component to their activities. There also is a political / espionage component to what they're doing. That creates particular challenges for our own organizations because, for example, RCMP, CSIS, they both have different mandates. RCMP is going to look at criminal components, CSIS is going to look at political interference. The problem is that we're facing that there's overlap. And what that means is that inevitably there's going to be blind spots. You look, for example, what Hezbollah has been doing, terrorism versus contraband cigarettes. One of them, again, is completely organized crime or criminal activities. The other is counterterrorism and whatnot. China has been very good at exploiting these blind spots in our societies. And again, Taiwan is very, very much struggling right now to figure out how to deal with that. So I'm not particularly current with the commission you were referring to, but I would certainly encourage the establishment of a working group that really brings together these different agencies and fuses the intelligence on the criminal side and the political interference side in Canada.
Okay, Bethany and then Puma.
Speaking again about forced technology transfers, I really appreciated your point, Charles, about how it's the small and medium-sized businesses that are really, really suffering. And the same is true in the U.S. The Chinese government has long denied that they promote forced technology transfers or that they have that as a policy, while in fact many American companies have said that it seems to be something that local governments or provincial governments actually promote in their companies. They say this is you should do this. It's good for China. It's good for you. China has denied that. However, the Trump administration has made a point of talking to their Chinese counterparts about forced technology transfers, and we have seen statements coming out of China saying, okay, we're going to pass a law making this illegal, or we're going to put pressure on our companies. I don't know if it's actually happening, but at least rhetorically we have seen movement on that. So if that's an issue here, I would hope that the Canadian government can at least make some words in the right direction.
Puma? No, sorry, just Puma. He wanted to speak.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, because Taiwan has been facing this kind of issue like for more than 50 years, I guess. So, I mean, my suggestion here, because I'm not really familiar with Canadian politics here, but I mean, it is crucial not to fall into the trap of proving something. Because like the NBA event, LeBron James says something kind of against Hong Kong and support China, right? But we cannot prove anything that the United Front approached LeBron James, or there's a order between the Xi Jinping and LeBron James. That even you can prove that, I mean, it's impossible. But that's the power of infiltration, because that market power, that capital could influence someone's mind and could manipulate like our perception. So that is why I think it's kind of important to do the counterintelligence part. We know that democracy, we need some legal tools to counteract all these issues, but sometimes it is more crucial to prove that there's a bad intention on the Chinese side. Once you prove that bad intention, then you can say all this infiltration, all these works are like, could not benefit democracy. So back to the 5G issue you just mentioned, the Huawei stuff. I mean, if you look into the content that people stated with Xinhua She, like all these news posts, like what they stated, or all the cyber force in China, how they state, how they frame this kind of issue, you can see that they are trying to dismiss or kind of distort this kind of argument. Because once you look back, and then you could see that anything China is doing right now, they can do it without Huawei. But if you focus like too much on Huawei, and then you will be distorted, and you will kind of dismiss this kind of issue, and you will never know what they're doing it right now. So this capability stuff and all this content stuff should be delved into details, and then you can see like the true threats, the true intention or the bad intention of China, and then to prove the impacts.
Final word, Margaret, and then we'll get another question.
Yeah, I just remind everyone that the whole big trade mess with the US and China right now started with this forced technology transfer issue, where the US Trade Representative's Office wrote a very comprehensive report called the Section 301 report that laid out in magnificent detail all of the IP issues and technology transfer problems, and giving competitors the American information on their factories and details and so on. All of that was all laid out. Trump put the tariffs on to bring China to the table to negotiate better business practices. Those negotiations have been going on for months and months now. They had me come down in April to brief USTR on my work on joint ventures, because I've delved deep into the companies and what the experience has been within the companies on this. And so I've been talking to them actually in the last week since the phase one deal was done. And there is a hope of trying to get something on IP or technology transfer into the phase one deal, but it looks like it'll probably be just an announcement of what's in the Foreign Investment Act already. And then phase two, they're somewhat optimistic for getting something addressed in phase two of all of these many, many, many problems. I'm not optimistic at all, because Trump has got his agriculture deal, which, by the way, we're going to hurt from that, because there's going to be overlap in the products that Trump now has to send to China for his $40 to $50 billion deal. That'll overlap with some of the products we want to sell to China, and we could find our own products displaced. That's a big issue.
And there's Tobias up front. And then we'll get you after. Okay, Tobias?
Not sure I need a microphone. My name's Tobias Fisher. I'm a retired journalist. I'll put a provocative question to all of you. You talked about the United Front. Is there any evidence, and Bob, I put this to you as well as anyone else, is there any evidence that Chinese agents of influence have infiltrated our parliament, both either the House of Commons or the Senate or the Foreign Affairs Department?
I'm already being sued by Michael Chan, so I would like to remove myself from answering that question.
Tobias, I won't, all I can say is that we've done stories of senators and MPs who traveled paid for by the Chinese government without letting us know, where they met senior people in the United Front. And the only reason we were able to find that out is that we started looking in Chinese websites where we saw pictures of them. And we wrote about it. And the fact the Senate Ethics Commissioner is still investigating three senators who were on one of these junkets. And one of the MPs who was also vice chair of the Canada-China Friendship Society, which is an MP junket club, didn't run in this election campaign. But so I know we can't draw a direct link, obviously, but there's smoke and maybe some fire. And this young woman rests. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, you'll get it. But it's a growing problem. Yeah. And it's if I just may say so, it's the way China operates in terms of agents of influence. They start at the municipal level, and then they go to the provincial, and then MPs. And there are examples, or at least indications, that people are far more sympathetic to the Beijing position than the Canadian one. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. My name is Anita Pan. I'm with Princeton University. I'm wondering, and I would absolutely agree that there's increasing bipartisan agreement that China is more of an adversary. But I see that there seems to be less consensus on China's activities of influence and how that might affect US national security. So I'd like to know, in your assessment, what exactly could be the threat to US national security based on China's activities in Canada, in Australia, in Taiwan. And what should the talking points be for Canadians looking to convey that message to US counterparts? Thank you.
Who wants to take it?
I mean, I think the key here is really money. You know, so many think tanks are recipients of People's Republic of China associated funding. And I think we need to demand much more transparency about where the money comes from. You know, all of the Confucius Institutes in Canada have agreements with their Canadian counterparts not to reveal the terms of the funding. I think that should stop. I think we need more transparency, and certainly, you know, as you say, with the parliamentary travel, at least if they report accurately, we find out who's been provided with money from a foreign power for a study tour of China, and that is information that should be front and center in terms of our deciding whether or not, you know, the golden rule applies, in the sense of he who has the gold makes the rule. And we do see more and more you know, use of Chinese funding. That the London School of Economics, I think just reported today, has, under considerable pressure of being exposed, decided not to receive funding from the famous Shanghai capitalist Eric Lee to establish a China studies program at LSE that would be overseen by a group of distinguished PRC experts.
We have the same problem in our universities. They get Confucian Institutes, for example, which are funded by China, and quite a number of Canadian universities have the Confucian Institutes. We know that the Huawei is a major funder of pure R&D research. They provide the money. We have really smart scientists who are doing the work, but Huawei patents their work, and then they send it back to China. And there's an even greater problem amongst Chinese students associations, where there is mainland Chinese students who have come to Canada to study. There's a great deal of influence over Chinese Canadian students on campuses, and it's a very difficult thing to report about because many of them are afraid to talk, and they're afraid to talk because they have relatives back home, and even though they may be Canadian citizens, they don't want to talk about this. And the Americans, it's a similar problem in the United States as well. Now we have.
Oh, may I?
Yes, sir.
No. This will have to be the last one.
Yes. Okay. Sorry, I did this.
Hi, thank you. We just went through an election, a federal election in Canada. And the only opportunity that Canadians had to listen to the leaders of the major federal parties articulate any kind of position on foreign policy was annihilated when the Munk Center decided to cancel after one of the candidates refused to participate in a foreign policy debate that they were planning. Arguably, at a time when Canada's foreign policy is in need of serious revision, the issues you're talking about clearly underscore that. Maybe MLI should be holding another seminar about sharpening up Canada's sharp power and its ability to respond. Why are we not seeing elite willingness to engage the public on these issues?
Well, maybe I'm going to let Brian answer that question.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, the question has several times been raised during the course of this conversation about think tanks and the possible corruption of their integrity by Chinese money. I just want everybody to know that every day I tell the Chinese ambassador that the beatings will continue until the check arrives. And if any of you have connections there, as I know some of you do, please pass that message along. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking all the speakers and panelists who have worked so hard to put on such a thorough, energetic, and insightful discussion of the challenges to Canada arising from the long arm of China's sharp power reaching deep into Canadian society and institutions. I also want to thank Bob Fife, of course, for his very able leading of such a, what's the word I want, vociferous panel. Please join me in thanking him. I also want to thank MLI's Taiwanese partners. First, there is, as you know, because you heard from him this evening from the Prospect Foundation, whose chairman, Tan-Sun Chen, the former foreign minister of Taiwan, is representing Prospect here. We're proud to have signed a memorandum of understanding with Prospect in January, in which both parties undertook to work together on areas of mutual interest and to enhance strong Taiwan-Canada relations. And this is part of a growing network of international connections that I'm very proud to say MLI is developing with think tanks in Britain, in Germany, in Latvia, in Korea, in Japan, in Taiwan, and many other places around the world. Our other partner, of course, is the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy, also generous supporters of our work on Chinese sharp power operations. We have a continuing collaboration with the foundation that includes J. Michael Cole's paper on the subject, a paper that grew out of Michael's presentation to a Taiwan Foundation for Democracy conference a couple of years ago. And the vice president of the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy, Chen Fai-yan, is here with us tonight, and I wish to acknowledge and thank both the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy and the Prospect Foundation for their support of MLI's work and for their presence here today. So, please. Our thanks as well go to the Taiwan Economic and Cultural Office, TECO, and their representative, Winston Wenyi Chen, who is also here with us. for their consistent support over the years. Taiwan is indeed well served by the quality of their diplomatic representation in Canada. Finally, two other people to thank. I want to thank the War Museum for this magnificent venue, and I'm glad to say that Mark O'Neill, who is the CEO of the Museum Corporation, if I can summarize, is here with us tonight, and it's always a pleasure to be at the War Museum. And finally, I have to thank my colleagues who push me around in my Pope-mobile and make me look good. I particularly want to mention David, Brett, Allison, Amber, and all the others from the MLI staff who work so hard to make events like this possible, and they have my personal thanks as well as I know yours. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for attending this event. We hope to see you at another MLI event very soon. Good night and safe travels home.